latest estimates, international tourism arrivals fell 64% in March and 98% in April, year on year. So if we wanted any illustration of a black swan event, then this is surely it. We've seen through the process of the last several months, travel bans and restrictions, which have made international travel very difficult, if not impossible. And this has been fueled by fear and uncertainty on future developments. Many people are just simply preferring to stay at home. So there are many there's a lot of speculation about what kind of recovery could take place. And originally there were hopes that maybe we would see a U-shaped recovery. But increasingly, the prospects of that seem to be more remote. It may be many years before the tourism industry recovers. And even if it does, it may be permanently changed in terms of what many people call the new normal. Nevertheless, though that sounds rather grim, there is some reason for optimism because many countries are trying to develop strategies for economic recovery. And in that process, the strengthening of everything in the spectrum, from promotion of domestic tourism to opening up to certain partner countries through the so-called travel bubbles, or through so-called green corridors, or through new protocols and procedures, is coming to the fore. So you see this in Europe with so-called green corridors. You see small island developing countries which are very tourism dependent, like Maldives, experimenting with travel bubbles and new protocols. So what I hope can happen today is that we have a conversation on domestic tourism and travel bubbles, and that in this fast evolving situation where no one really has clear answers, we hope that this conversation can help us come to the right questions and maybe some ways forward. This situation is really unprecedented in our lifetime. So we're charting into really we're sailing into uncharted territory. And so the discussion today in these difficult times will be very, very important. I'm excited to listen to it and to listen to all of you and learn from all of you. And I want to thank my colleague Sin Young Park for the massive effort that she and ERCD have put in kind of lifting up the nature of our dialogue. And I want to thank both my colleague Anna Fink and Matthias Heble, who have been doing huge work in putting this particular webinar together, and the fact that I see that we have 76 people already participating in this tells me that this will be of huge interest. With that, Anna, I want my boring voice to stop and the more interesting voices of the webinar to begin. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Arjun. I'll just give a brief overview of the agenda. So over the next 20 minutes, we'll hear presentations from Zorica Orozovic from the UN World Travel Organization, or and also Matthias Helber. Saritza is Director of Institutional Relations and Partnerships at the World Travel Organization and Special Representative to the UN in Geneva. She's going to be presenting today on the global impact of COVID-19 on the tourism industry. Matthias Helber is an economist in the Regional Cooperation and Integration Division of ADB's Economic Research Department. He's going to be presenting on research regarding the potential of domestic tourism and travel bubbles for recovery of the industry in Asia Pacific. Following the presentations, I will introduce our panel of experts and we'll spend about an hour on a moderated discussion relating to the potential of domestic tourism and travel bubbles for recovery. I will try to carve out 10 to 15 minutes at the end of the panel discussion for Q&A, and I'll give instructions for how to submit your questions at that time. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Saritza to start her presentation. Thank you very much.
Good morning to everyone. Sorry, good afternoon for you. It's early in Europe. Thank you for inviting the World Tourism Organization to be part of this conversation. I think I could not have expected a better setting the scene that what Arjun has just made today. We are facing unprecedented situation with the total stop of tourism activity, but we have as well maybe an incredible opportunity as well, because as much as tourism was not very well understood before, it is very, very well understood today. Next slide. It is demonstrating that the sector and its ecosystem, the broad value chain of the industry that compose the sector and the supply chains, as they have come to a standstill, we have seen so many economies really and livelihoods being put at threat. I can say what the World Tourism Organization has been doing immediately when the lockdown started is to definitely measure the impact, because as we do have the conveying power of gathering overall statistics globally, and of course trying to support countries as much as possible with the months that passed, and I think that Arjun just set the scene and explains through numbers which are quite shocking, I can say, because they are just making the sector at the zero activity level. So the main action we have been undertaking is really to start to support countries and try to enter in a phase of survival of enterprises and livelihoods, which has been really the immediate response, and building plans and guidelines. As we have seen, the impact has been huge. Next slide. We are looking at loss of 850 million to 1.1 billion of international tourism arrival and loss in revenue. We are looking as well at 100 to 120 million jobs at risk. And I think that what we ought to do is really to have a people-centered response, because this crisis is really having a huge magnitude on impact on livelihoods. Next slide. Can I have next slide? Thank you. The scenario are as well quite backward. The scenarios are quite as well difficult to forecast. As we know, the pandemic is not over. We are living in a time of uncertainty, and we are looking at the drop for the year of 58 to 78%, depending on the openness of borders and travel restrictions. Next slide. We have compared, even though the sector is very resilient, We have seen that in the other crises that we can compare ourselves to, with SARS and the big economic downturn in 2009 and 10, the magnitude of this crisis is going to be much longer to recover. Next. We know that in some advanced and emerging economies, many of which ADB is working with, the share of GDP and in the global economy, in tourism and GDP, is quite huge and important. Next. And most importantly, while looking at the shares of domestic tourism against international tourism, which is certainly one of the key topic of the discussion today, is how to rebond. One of the key solutions definitely is on domestic tourism, and this is not easy to apply to all economies of the countries you serve and you are involved, because in many of these countries, domestic tourism is very, very minimal. And the purchasing power of the country inhabitant do not allow for a huge impact on domestic tourism, and therefore other alternative needs to be sought. Next. The islands and seas are really the most severely hit. We just had a conversation with Fiji and the Pacific Island just 2 hours before we are talking to you now. And we definitely know that livelihoods are really a threat, severely hit by the travel restrictions and the incapacity for the tourism operators to have any kind of activities, being it in direct operation in the industry or the suppliers. Next. Next. So we are looking at jobs that are lost, and we are looking at the estimate today in terms of recovery could be in 2021, we could recover about 39% of the market in international tourism and about 15% in domestic. Next. We have issued and we have shared a number of guidelines that were prepared under the umbrella of the Global Crisis Committee, which was composed and led by UNWTO, calling upon government, countries, international organizations and institutions and the civil society to really look at how to really address recovery. Next. And for us, what, as I said at the earliest, providing liquidity and protecting jobs is definitely the most important. We have been supporting countries to better negotiate the financial packages with international finance institutions so that tourism is included, being it for the SMEs that compose the sector or for the livelihoods, as we know that 60% of tourism workers are in the informal sector. So those social flow protection and livelihoods need to be sustained while preparing for reopening of borders and recovery. So the most important immediate action that needs to be undertaken while preparing for receiving tourists is definitely protocols that needs to be integrated in the operations in order to preserve the safety of the workers and as well build confidence to the market. And I think countries that are going to be able to integrate those protocols, creating a sufficient confidence in the markets, can really be the most successful. Now, this has, the crisis has as well demonstrated that the public partnership, private partnership, and with the global community has been unprecedented. And I think that now more than ever, this collaboration is necessary. We, of course, know that in some destinations, borders are opening, but we see as well in the last 2 weeks that some destinations are again under lockdown, even the ones that have been opening the borders. So we are really navigating in an uncertainty time. We see the value of creating new jobs and supporting efforts with technology and digitalization. This is definitely something that is at the forefront of any strategy for recovery. And of course, we see as well, because we might have liquidity and fiscal incentives and financial packages that we might be as well needing to include in sustainability, not only because it's good for the planet, but because it's good for the business. And anything that can help to reducing costs while reducing carbon footprint is going to be a part of the solution. Next. I'll try to illustrate here what is the scenario and what is the context in which we are evolving. And I would rather focus on the box on the right side bottom, building confidence for visitors and market. And I think that adaptability and intelligence when it comes to opening of borders and travel restrictions is definitely going to be a key solution and a key way forward. In saying that, I just would like to draw your attention what we can bring in this discussion and in this discourse. We have created a dashboard on monitoring impact, but not only data, but as well on policies. So we are ongoingly and weekly updating any changes that we are collecting directly from the member states and through intelligence from other sources. But most importantly, this is certainly the most accurate information you can get, besides the one that you can have in your neighborhood, but it can as well help, especially in international tourism, long distance and international travel coming outside the region is important to monitor as well. Next slide. We have, I'm just introducing to you a number of resources that we have created in supporting public and private sector. We have seen an incredible appetite of private enterprises, associations, and industries to share their data with us because they saw the value as well in having the capacity for them to consult other type of data that they need. So I think that this is as well an interesting element to bring into the conversation where definitely we can see progress and we can see and shape better strategies according to the analysis of this data available. We have as well put together a very strategic approach to recovery. It's called here. It's I would say it's the Tourism Recovery Technical Assistance Package, which is helping destinations in shaping a very structured way in which to approach recovery and resilience, and taking into account economic recovery, markets, and institutional strengthening, because these three cannot be dissociated and needs to be really looked at in a very, very structured manner. Next. What is the strength of joining forces? We have seen that the model of only supporting by, I can say, knowledge or technical assistance is not sufficient. I mean, I'm speaking because we are coming from a world of being a UN entity and a development partner. We see that never before the model of the combination of the knowledge that we can provide and support we can provide and an international finance institution is definitely the best recipe for recovery and for success, because this crisis is going to require a magnitude of resources and capacity to sustain and to reinvest in the sector. And therefore, support only in strategizing is not going to be sufficient. So definitely the recovery needs to be a combination of one hand support and on the other hand investment. Thank you. Next. We have seen as well that measuring the impact really help us to provide more, I can say, more informed strategies and policies. And I'm just sharing a snapshot on the methodology we are currently implementing and developing in certain of the countries of your region as well. We have pilots, is sustainability, measuring sustainability in these three dimensions: economic, social, and environmental. And this is as well going to help to better shape what are the area where we have a comparative advantage in investing, so as to increase the competitiveness of the destination, of course. Next. We have currently in your region 3 countries in which we are piloting the MST, measuring sustainable tourism, from a various perspective, because we know that scarcity of natural resources is definitely an impediment and an obstacle. So on water, waste, energy, and of course biodiversity loss, which can be a threat to the tourism attractiveness of the destination and the USP. Next. So what is our proposition for the future? Definitely a more integrated model in which sustainability and digitalization are going to be embedded, using the power of the conveying power of aggregated information and shared information. The importance to empower all stakeholders and stimulate the dialogue. This is what we are doing today in this policy dialogue, and really definitely inspire action for building and shaping a new business model in line with what and how the crisis is evolving. Next. Next slide. So I'm happy to answer to any other question that may arise in the conversation. As I was already exchanging with Matthias, we are very cautious on travel bubbles as an organization, because it relates as well to, I can say, the rights of people of movement, but as well, we know as well that there is a real fragility in all the agreements, and the time you need to build the agreements, the bilateral or the regional agreements for exchange and allowing travelers to come, times can change and the pandemic can as well take over. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Saritsa, for that excellent presentation to provide the context of what we're talking about today. And also thank you for highlighting the importance of the partnership between IFIs and the World Tourism Organization. I know ADB has a number of ongoing partnerships, and that we're looking to strengthen that even further. I will hand over now to Matthias to begin his presentation. Thank you.
Hello, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Very good. So let's start. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a great pleasure to present today. I would like to share with you some of the results of research that we have been conducting here at ADB on the topic of reviving tourism amid the COVID-19 pandemic. So I will first show you an overview of tourism that actually developed very positively prior to the COVID-19, and then show you some of the estimates that we have been producing. Load it up. So as you can see here, we have the destination of the world travelers. So these are all international tourists, and we produce this graph, and it shows where do actually tourists go to. And as you can see, there's an increasing share of tourists that travel. So this is the number of tourists by origin. And you see that in the year 2000, about 20% of international travelers came from Asia. And this share has now increased to more than 30% in the year 2018. Now, Asia is not only an important source of tourists, it's also an important destination. And you can see here, this is a share when we look at where are the tourists going. And again, it's a similar development from about 20% in terms of destination. Asia has increased its share to over 30%. And now comes the COVID-19 pandemic, and we see this very sharp contraction. And I don't want to spend too much time I just looked up the latest numbers published by IATA, and we can clearly see that in May and April 2020, international flights came really to a halt. The recovery seems to happen already for the domestic flights. We have here flights for China, Japan, Russia, and the US. And you see in China, where the pandemic, of course, was first, they already have some recovery taking place. However, the recovery is slow, it's bumpy, and also still now we're only at minus 40% compared to last year. So it will probably be a long way back to the old or new normal. This also reflected in the traveler sentiments. So this is a survey that IATA has done in the months of April and again in June. And what you can see actually that the traveler sentiments have actually worsened. So they asked the question, when do you intend to go back to travel? And in the April survey, they said it will be within the next 2 months. Now people are saying it will be more or less, or more often it will happen in the 6 to 12 months. So sentiments are not good, and it shows that people are afraid to travel, and it's going to be hard to restart tourism, at least in the short run. But so what can countries do? In the following, I will try to walk you through 3 scenarios that we have been analyzing. The first one is based on domestic tourism. So how can countries fully exploit domestic tourism? The second one is what's the potential to enter bilateral agreements with the largest source country? And finally, what about sub-regional travel bubbles where more than 2 countries enter into agreement to open up international travel? So let me start with domestic tourism. And it's based on a very simple idea. You basically redirect your outbound travelers to domestic destinations. And it's actually already happening now that in a lot of countries, people want to actually stay closer to home. They avoid mass transportation, and therefore they provide a boost to domestic tourism. Now, in order to estimate more or less the potential for domestic tourism, we calculated a travel balance. So we looked at the difference between outbound and inbound tourists. And if you have a surplus, of course, then domestic tourism is a viable option if fully exploited, and if it's really possible to redirect all outbound travelers to domestic destinations. But if you face a deficit, then of course additional measures are needed to help the tourism industry. And of course, domestic tourism is not without challenges. First of all, there's often a mismatch between the reasons for travel domestically and internationally. People travel often to see a different culture, a different country. Then, of course, there is often a mismatch between a demand in a country and the supply. Another issue is about foreign exchange earnings. A lot of developing countries, they rely on foreign exchange earnings generated by tourism. Of course, with domestic tourists, you won't get these foreign exchange earnings. The economic downturn due to the pandemic has also, of course, lowered the demand for tourism in general. And then we also see that in some countries, we have local lockdowns that also prohibit domestic tourism. But if you put this aside and just assume that countries would be able to redirect their outbound tourists to domestic destinations, then this is the picture. So for a relatively large number of countries, we see that actually domestic tourism could be a good option. We see a lot of green bars saying that there is more than enough. There are more than enough domestic tourists to fill the gap. But if you look more in detail, we find that for some of the economies where tourism is a very important source, like for example Fiji, Maldives, Cambodia, Malaysia, Thailand, domestic tourism will not be enough to even closely cover the gap left by international guests. So for these countries, of course, it's very appealing to look into preferential partner travel bubbles. So these are basically bilateral agreements between economies to allow business and or leisure travelers to travel bilaterally. And of course, they need to comply with a strict health protocol. And we assume in this simulation that the economies enter a bilateral reciprocal travel bubble with the largest source of tourists. So they would have the option to convince their largest source partner to enter into agreement. And we would assume that the number of bilateral tourists would reach the pre-crisis level of 2018. So we basically say not all international outbound travelers can be redirected to the partner. And so far, there are already 4 travel bubbles in place between countries, and I will show you these bubbles in a second. Of course, if you have to negotiate with a partner, it's much more complex than just trying to promote domestic tourism. Let's look at the results. So these are the results when we say, yeah, what would happen if every country here in the region for which we have data would enter into a preferential partner travel bubble. And as you can see, for many countries, of course, the situation is better than just promoting domestic tourism, especially for the economies that depend a lot on a particular source country, like, for example, Fiji, Australia. We see that the number in terms of the gap now goes down from over 80% to a little bit more than 40. Similarly, we have other countries where we see a great improvement from the case of domestic tourism. These are some of the bubbles that are currently in place. We have the earliest one in the region was between PRC and Korea. It became effective on May 1st. It's for the moment only for business travelers. We have a similar arrangement between PRC and Singapore. And also now Japan and Vietnam agreed basically to allow for business travel. And another very recent travel bubble is between Thailand and a number of countries. These are basically important economic partners. And again, people who work in Thailand and have a work permit, they can enter Thailand again. But of course, everybody needs to follow strict health protocols. So this brings me to the last scenario of sub-regional travel bubbles. So we assume here that 3 or more countries within the same sub-region would agree to allow tourism to take place again. And just to give you an example, there is currently negotiation taking place between Australia, Fiji, and New Zealand about the Bula bubble. Also, Brunei, Malaysia, and Singapore are negotiating about a sub-regional bubble. For our simulation, we again assumed that the tourism would reach the pre-crisis level of 2018. And the sub-regional bubbles that we simulate are CAREC, East Asia, Pacific, SAARC, and GMS. But of course, having a lot of partners around the table can make the negotiations tricky. And also, if in one country there's an outbreak, as we have seen recently in Australia, it is also difficult to reach an agreement. So these are the scenarios. If we look at the sub-regional travel bubbles, you can note that, for example, in South Asia, it's not the best outcome for countries like Maldives. The reason is that a lot of tourists that go to the Maldives are not from the sub-region, but from places outside the sub-region. So these sub-regional bubbles can help in certain cases. For example, the Pacific now, in case of a travel bubble, including Australia, New Zealand, and the other Pacific countries, this would actually help a lot of these countries to close the gap that is left by international tourists. Now, let me finish, and I hope I can stay in time. For the moment, we just looked at flows of tourists. Of course, the important consideration when it comes to the negotiations of these travel bubbles are public health considerations. And here we just want to highlight 2. Of course, the most obvious one is where are countries in terms of the COVID-19 outbreak? Have they passed the peak? Have they now very low rates of infections? So we looked at that and said, is the average daily rate now of new infections below 3% compared to the peak? And the second issue that is important in this context is, of course, the pandemic preparedness. Can countries actually handle an outbreak of the coronavirus? And for that, we used a ranking developed by the Deep Knowledge Group that ranks country according to their pandemic preparedness. And when doing so and looking again at these preferential partner travel bubbles, and now I would like to ask you to look at the bottom. Number one indicates the pandemic preparedness, and number two, whether the countries have passed the peak. So you first of all see that not so many countries have a healthcare system that is really prepared to handle a large outbreak, or even a smaller one. And if you look where the countries are past the peak, the situation again looks dire. Not many countries have actually really passed the peak. So we see that we have both a green light for the preparedness and past the peak. We only see actually Korea and China at the moment. So this is basically for July. So it will take time, I guess, to put these travel bubbles in place. And the discussion that we're having now in the panel, I think we will touch upon a lot of important issues. So let me just conclude. So domestic tourism could possibly fill some of the gap left by international travelers. However, it's especially the case in countries where tourism is not playing a major role. Where tourism is playing a major role, domestic tourism will certainly not be enough. Bilateral travel bubbles can help to reduce the gap. However, again, there are still large gaps remain when you just open up to your preferred partner. Then sub-regional bubbles could be a viable option, especially for East Asia. However, it's kind of challenging to negotiate with many partners, where also the pandemic is at different stages, and also the preparedness. So overall, when we take all this into account, I think the current space to negotiate these bubbles are still small, but maybe in the medium term that there might be more options. That's all from my side. Thank you very much.